We are talking about perfect competition and how a firm would maximize its profits in a purely competitive industry. The way it maximizes its profits, of course, is by maximizing the difference between total revenue and total cost. We understand the cost relationships of a purely competitive firm. We've talked about those, you've drawn them, you've had quizzes on them, and the cost relationships for a purely competitive firm are going to be very similar to the cost relationships for a monopolistic firm or a huge oligopolistic firm or whatever. So we know about the cost relationships for a purely competitive firm. Let's look at the revenue relationships for a purely competitive firm. What are the revenue relationships for a purely competitive firm? Well, the revenue relationships would look like this. They would be total revenue, TR, average revenue, call that AR, and our good friend marginal revenue. Marginal revenue. Those are the three cost relationships that we are looking for. Now, that we want to understand. Now, all of these cost relationships will derive from the demand curve. All of these cost relationships will derive from the demand curve. So, if we can figure out what the demand curve for an individual firm, not for the entire market, but for an individual firm operating in a perfectly competitive industry looks like, we'll easily be able to derive these revenue relationships. What is a perfectly competitive industry? What does that look like? Well, there are several factors that would distinguish a perfectly competitive industry from a highly competitive industry or a really competitive industry or a kind of competitive industry. A perfect competitive industry is going to have the following characteristics. Many sellers, it's hard to write like this. Many sellers, and I also might add many buyers. Many sellers and many buyers. This is a waste of time because you can't read that anyway. So, I'll just use this to draw the curves. The second is that all of the products within the industry are going to be so similar that the consumer is indifferent as to which brand he buys. In real life, you care probably whether you buy Nike or Adidas. You might care whether you buy Polo Ralph Lauren or Kmart sweater. I don't know. But in a perfectly competitive industry, you wouldn't care if you bought your widget from Acme Corporation or from Beta Corporation or from Bill's Corporation, because a widget would be a widget. So the products would be, if not identical, then so similar that the consumer wouldn't care which product he bought, which of course is going to mean that the factor that's going to determine from whom he will buy it will be the price, rather than the other bells and whistles and the polo players and the logos and all of that. So, the first two is there are many market participants, many market participants. And second is that the products within the industry are, as your author calls them, homogeneous, means they're the same. So similar that the consumer doesn't care which brand he buys. Now, a third factor is easy entry and exit into the industry. There are no barriers to entry. There are easy entry by other firms or exit. For example, if a firm within a perfectly competitive industry is making economic profits, it's real easy for entrepreneurs to enter in and start up a very similar firm. Now, it would not be so, for example, if automobile firms were making economic profits. You and I couldn't get together and start our own automobile firm. So there would be a barrier to entry. For example, financial barriers. However, for a perfectly competitive firm, no barriers. You want to start up one of these firms, boom, you can do it overnight, hypothetically. And there's no barriers to exit, no laws preventing you from going out of business, for example. So, the three characteristics that make up a purely competitive firm is, in no particular order, many market participants, homogeneous products, and easy entry. So now these three characteristics of a perfectly competitive industry are going to indicate to us what the demand curve will look like. The demand curve, as you know, when we started this semester, PQ is a downward sloping line. Typical demand curve. Every demand curve we've ever drawn has been a downward sloping line. Now, how downward sloping is it, the demand curve for an individual firm's product in a purely competitive industry? Well, given the fact that there are lots of different sellers in the industry, that's going to tend to make an individual firm's demand curve more elastic. And as it becomes more elastic, it'll become flatter. The more substitutes they are, the more elastic, or the flatter the demand curve will become. But not only are there a lot of substitutes, but the substitutes are perfect substitutes for one another because the products are homogeneous. That's going to make the demand curve even more elastic. I don't know if you can see that or not. I tried to draw the demand curve even flatter, indicating that it is more elastic. In the extreme, in the classic case of pure competition, there are so many other market participants, and the products are so identical that the demand curve will be perfectly elastic. So the demand curve, there's Q, there's P. The demand curve for an individual firm's product will be perfectly elastic. Look at that. That is so flat that it is perfectly elastic. That's supposed to be a horizontal demand curve. Here's the price of the product, maybe $5 a piece. And the demand curve shoots off horizontally from that point on the price axis. So, the demand curve for a purely or perfectly competitive firm is horizontal. Interestingly enough, your author begins explaining this on page 179, which is in part of the short run costs chapter. So check this out, page 179, where the demand curve for a individual firm's product in a perfectly competitive industry is derived. I'll make another little movie here in just a second.